Get started because we have a great roundtable for today's discussion. I want to welcome you all from literally all over the world. One of the best parts of the Environmental Peacebuilding Association is we have people tuning in from all over. So this session today is the yearly roundtable on environmental peacebuilding, a year in review and the year ahead. It's sponsored by the Environmental Peacebuilding Association, or NPACS for short. It's an annual webinar where we have a chance to hear from leading scholars and practitioners focused on different sectors, different issue areas, different geographies, connected to the topics of peace and conflict, environment security through a lens of environmental peace building. My name is Geoff Dabelko. I'm a professor at the Voinovich School of Leadership and Public Service, and it really is a privilege to be chairing this session again. I've had the chance to work on these issues at the Woodrow Wilson Center, the Environmental Change and Security Program, where I was director for 15 years. Proud to say I'm a founding board member of NPACS and thrilled that the association has grown so much in terms of numbers and reach and diversity of practitioners and scholars and all different levels and time periods in people's careers. So it's a great group. If you're an NPACS member already, terrific. Make full use of all the different opportunities that it affords, like today's webinar. If you're not, I urge you to check it out because it is a really diverse and wide-ranging group, and also is here just in the last couple of years becoming another forum with the sponsorship of the Environment Security Journal, and we'll hear a little bit about that today as well. So our game plan for today will be for me to introduce our three panelists. I'll do all three of them up front, and we'll do a couple rounds of questions that are kind of open-ended ones that let them take it in a number of different directions. These are experienced people with work in different issue areas, different geographies, a lot of cross-cutting issues, so that their experiences, I think, will resonate with many parts of the world. And so really looking forward to hear their reflections kind of back a year and forward. We will then have time for Q&A, although I will urge you, because of course it becomes a rush, and we have a lot of really bright, smart, and inquisitive people on today's webinar. So I urge you, if you have a question, put it in the chat, so perhaps we can pull it into the discussion up front, and just to try to get more of that kind of interaction that we're always most interested in doing. So let me introduce today's panelists. Jojo Nem Singh is a global fellow at the Woodrow Wilson Center's Environmental Change and Security Program. He's also a fellow at the Weinthal Institute for Strategic Competition. He's an incoming fellow at the School of Global Studies at the University of Sussex in the UK, I think starting next month. And he's the principal investigator of a European Research Council research program entitled Green Industrial Policy in the Age of Rare Metals, a trans-regional comparison of growth strategies in rare earths mining, or GRIP-ARM. He's also a founding member of the Criminal Minerals Policy Lab at the University of Sussex. And in January 2025, so this month, he was also appointed as the Asian Regional Research Coordinator of the Global Green Industrial Policy Lab set up by the Transnational Institute in Amsterdam. His most recent book is Business of the State: Why State Ownership Matters for Resource Governance. The second, Bram Evis, works as an environment and conflict consultant with the International Crisis Group's Latin America office based out of Bogota, Colombia, focused on the Amazon, directing the efforts there. He's the founder and director of the recently created Amazon Underworld, a project he and colleagues developed when he was a research fellow with the Pulitzer Center on Crisis Reporting, reflecting Bram's longtime work in investigative journalism. He researches resource conflicts and border instabilities, particularly in the Andean region, worked on these resource conflicts, drug policies, state corporate crimes, criminal activity in Latin America since 2010. He's been active as an NGO consultant and investigative journalist, as I mentioned, publishing in a wide variety of investigative media with lots of different formats in terms of the reporting. and was a lead journalist, the lead journalist for an award-winning interactive media production on mining conflicts in Venezuela. So you can find Bram's work, the written word and videos and all sorts of dynamic reporting in these challenging environments. And finally, Erika Weinthal is the John O. Blackburn Distinguished Professor and Chair of Environmental Social Systems Division at the Nicholas School of the Environment at Duke University. She specializes in global environmental politics, environment security, with a particular emphasis on water and energy. Her work has spanned many geographies and locations, and so has the insight of those kinds of comparisons, which is always really valuable. I would say also proud to have had Erika as one of the chapter authors of the environmental peacemaking book that Ken Conk and I did back in 2002 since we're talking about environmental peace building. But Erika is the author of State Making and Environmental Cooperation, Linking Domestic Politics and International Politics in Central Asia, which won a number of awards. She co-authored Oil is Not a Curse and Water Quality Impacts of the Energy-Water Nexus. And then I think in part with this kind of leadership perspective in the field, she's co-edited Water and Post-Conflict Peacebuilding, Shoring Up Peace, the Oxford Handbook on Water, Politics and Policy, and I will conclude because these are folks have done a lot of interesting things, so I wanted to share. But Erika was the founding vice president of the Environmental Peacebuilding Association, has just been elected president. And so one of the things that I'll urge Erika to do is speak about impacts and the journal Environment Security, in which she's an editor. And so that's part of the perspectives that we're bringing in terms of the focused research, but also kind of how the field is developing. So with those introductions, I'm going to jump into the discussion and can go in the order and kind of pose one question, and all three of you have a chance to answer it. So maybe Jojo, we can start with you. What do you see are some of the key environmental peace building developments in the work that you do, kind of regionally, topically, that you have focused on over the past year? Where's the work you've been doing and that kind of connects to this environmental peace building agenda over the last year?
Thanks, George. All right, so I think there's maybe two things that I want to point out as a starting point for our conversation. So the first and the big point is I work on critical minerals, critical raw materials. I mean, I do a lot on rare earth minerals, but all the other minerals as well. I think the general point is that critical minerals security now is framed not only from the conversation around energy transition and transition as a transition metal, but it has been part of a larger debate around strategic competition and the high-tech war. What this means is there seems to be less differentiation between the different types of markets and commodities that are needed as we proceed, as we move forward in when we think of energy transition, when we think of the high-tech competition between China and the US. So just last year, the Chinese have decided to specifically target access of American companies on antimony, on germanium, gallium, which are needed for high tech. That's not the situation that you had before, in which we still think nickel, copper, rare earth would be accessible, for companies to buy them in the global mining market. So there's been changes in terms of the market dynamics. The extent to which it's closed or open needs to be empirically observed, and we need to have some nuances. But I think it's fair to say that this growing hawkishness, not just, I think, in the side of the US, but also in the case of China, that they've now decided to engage more directly on strategic competition. This will impact the pathway, the pace, the scope of our energy transition globally. The second most important, I think, event, so to speak, that I've been looking at, and I think will have significant impact globally, is the passage of the Critical Raw Materials Act in Europe. The CRM Act is supposedly the missing piece that kind of puts together the different pieces of EU legislation towards an energy transition pathway for Europe. What this means is that it coordinates the upstream demand, the demand in the upstream sector in the mining industry, the demand for minerals, to strategic autonomy objectives, to the clean energy transition, the high-tech ambitions of the European Union. And I want to be very specific in terms of what the CRM does. There's two things that it does. One is it creates pressure for companies and countries to diversify the sources of their supply. So that's one aspect, and that's part of the broad swathe of trade deals that the EU has been going through. So the EU has just, signed an FTA with Kazakhstan, with Chile, in the Philippines as well, to get access to different types of minerals. So that's one, diversification of supply chains. The second, and I think most important aspect, is that it is fast-tracking the extraction, the production, the recycling, the research and innovation initiatives within the European Union. And this is important because we have to remember the historical context in which EU understood extraction. EU has had very long colonial history. It always used resource extraction as a means to promote its own industrialization. So this is quite a big step in terms of strategic autonomy objectives. And they're very, very ambitious. The Act specifically says that by 2030, we need to have 10% of all the EU consumption of minerals extracted within the continent. 40% of processing needs to take place within the European Union. 25% of recycling has to be done within the context of the EU. And most importantly, it has legislated that not more than 65% of a specific mineral can be outsourced from outside, meaning if a country like China controls 100% of heavy rare earth elements, they need at some stage to develop a strategy in order to reduce that dependency on China and bring it down to 65%. So these are two, I think, big important changes in this year.
Thank you very much, Jojo. If I could ask a follow-up. So can you, those of us who aren't experts in tracking these kind of mineral questions so much yet, see the importance of it for these technologies, but also for the kind of questions of peace and conflict and environmental and social conditions around points of extraction. Do you see this new, strong incentive for recycling as something that will fundamentally or has the potential to change kind of projections for, these big numbers we see in teams of doubling, tripling, quadrupling the extracted mined minerals and metals for a green energy transition? How should those of us who aren't tracking this so closely understand what the potential for that kind of recycling intervention might mean?
So I would say that it's really important that the EU places recycling and circularity at the center of its energy transition strategy. That's a really good, it's a good starting point because there's a whole swathe of legislations that come on labeling, R&D, investments, etc., which means that when you prioritize recycling, you actually develop a market around it. So that's, I think, the good news. The point of caution, though, is that we shouldn't expect that recycling will overtake the primary extraction, simply because the amount of extraction that is being demanded in order to transition is, at the moment, quite huge. And so I think it becomes an issue if one makes an argument that, oh, we should do recycling because we will eventually get rid of the mining production. So I think I just want to be clear that there are technical studies that have been done looking at that. They haven't actually got the numbers and the market conditions to build a recycling industry isn't there yet. So I think we should also just be cautious in terms of making and promoting and saying that recycling is going to be the solution to the extractive problem. I think the extraction imperative is there. Erika's work I've used a lot, has been focused so much on putting governance conditions on mining. And I think that's a recognition of the fact that we cannot wish away mining if we want a clean energy transition. So I really just think this is a trade-off question. It's not like we have to give everything up, but I think, we have to pace expectations. And also we should have a better idea in terms of how we slowly reduce the extraction of primary commodities, meaning how do we move from being entirely reliant to the primary supply chain towards a more resilient secondary supply chain. So to me, the energy transition pathway is a situation where we will have a mixture of a primary and a secondary supply chain, hopefully both robust, both able to provide, the minerals that we need in order for us to have a more sustainable transition pathway. But I think saying that one is better than the other is kind of missing the point of the energy transition dilemma.
Right. Well, thank you for that nuance. That helps put it in context in terms of potentially good news, but is not kind of some panacea or silver bullet that's going to just make as much as we'd like to wish away these challenges. Terrific. Thank you so much, Jojo. Bram, can we turn to you and with that same question in terms of what do you see as the key environmental peace building developments in your work and where have you been? Tell us about the work you've been doing because you've been busy for sure.
Thank you so much, Geoff, for the introduction. Also, maybe good to explain that I'm mainly involved in journalistic and endeavors and consulting for several NGOs, but I've started with this work being a criminologist. And the reason that I studied criminology had also to do with the crimes we see that are occurring against the environment and address the harm here in Latin America, which is basically my playing field. So for everybody, I'm based in Colombia, mostly covering the Amazon region, which we consider is a very much hostile environment for multiple reasons. Latin America might be the most violent continent in the world when we look at homicide rates, but these homicide rates on average in the Amazon oftentimes supersede regional averages. There's many reasons for that, and maybe one of the reasons in the future that will continue to these drastic escalations of violence might be the economies that are branded right now at international fora as bioeconomy, energy transition, because we know here in Colombia that some of the illicit rents extracted from, for example, carbon credits end up with groups that generate violence. And it was really interesting for me to listen to Jojo because here in Latin America, there's a lot of talks about lithium in a triangle between Chile, Argentina, and Bolivia, which is well known and well studied. What is less known is the presence of rare earth elements and rare metals and metalloids in the Amazon basin. But we know that non-state armed groups and state security forces are already occupying lands rich in these elements, minerals, and metalloids. And we very much anticipate more conflict in the future. We feel this is very understudied. At the moment, I'm coordinating research to basically map what is there, where is it, and what are the hidden interests behind them. So anybody involved in similar studies or interested in this, I'd be definitely happy to follow up on that. But first, since we're talking about environmental peace building, unfortunately, we need to talk about a country that I'm living in for already more than 10 years, which is Colombia. In Colombia, as all of you might know, internal conflict dynamics for over half a century are intrinsically linked to land access and the presence of natural resources. We know that the natural environment and conflict in Colombia was victimized by the war on drugs due to indiscriminate aerial sprayings with glyphosate. We know that oil infrastructure was blown up by terrorist groups in order to extort these oil multinationals, and there was huge environmental harm due to conflict in Colombia. But if conflict is linked to the environment, so is peace. So when in 2016, the government of Juan Manuel Santos signed the peace treaty with the former largest guerrilla organization, FARC, negotiators renounced the deal for its green aspects, basically halting deforestation, reintegrating ex-combatants into sustainable alternative economic opportunities, and also recognize the environment as a victim of conflict and therefore entitle it with the right to reparation. What happened is that when the FARC demobilized, which contrary to popular belief in Colombia was a huge success because over 90% of the former combatants laid down their weapons and became civilians. what happened is that the FARC controlled large areas of Amazon rainforest and they limited deforestation because they needed the jungle cover to move troops, set up camp, and what they also did is they used forest logging restrictions to control populations. So when the FARC left, the government didn't show up in the subsequent years destined for peace building. Who showed up were bands of loggers, illegal gold miners, industrial agriculturists, and deforestation spiked in Colombia during the proximate president after Juan Manuel Santos, Ivan Duque. Ivan Duque received stick from the international community and mounted a series of law enforcement crackdowns branded Operation Artemis, in which he basically took community members in handcuffs in front of the cameras, explaining to the public that he was arresting the responsible ones for deforestation. Nevertheless, he failed to go after the financiers of deforestation, which continued to escalate in Colombia. When Gustavo Petro, Colombia's current president, won in 2022, he betted big on environmental peace building. Instead of branding local communities as enemies instrumentalized by organized crime to log rainforests, he said that these communities could be the most important ally to work on restorative projects and to work on forest conservation. We definitely, especially with International Crisis Group, welcome this attitude, but only if the government had territorial control, which they didn't, which meant that new offshoots of the former FARC, let's say different FARC dissident franchises, other non-state armed groups, and organized crime, who drastically augmented their presence in the Amazon and logged for the last decades record numbers of Amazon rainforests, controlled the area, meaning that Colombia's Amazon became a weapon of war. While protecting the environment stands at the center of Gustavo Petro's political agenda, we see that armed groups and not the state are actually controlling the tropical rainforest, which is very important to understand because the current government gives so much emphasis to environmental protection and peace building. But what we see is that these groups started to wield the power strategically to advance their interests and basically had a button. Non-state armed groups could decrease deforestation, as happened in 2022 and 23, to please the government and advance cycles of dialogue, because Colombia's current government bets at a total peace strategy, dialoguing with all non-state armed groups. So these non-state armed groups present in the Amazon kept deforestation in check to get on the good side of the government. But in 2024, we also saw that they could escalate and put the button to the right and increase deforestation to pressure the government. And 2024 was a crucial year for Colombia because it hosted the COP16 on biodiversity, which meant that these armed groups were basically strong arming or even extorting the states, threatening with deforestation, escalation, while Colombia was organizing a main environmental event. So, as part of its flagship program, Criminal Minds actually used environmental strategies to their benefit because they control the main environmental assets in Colombia. So what we think is that there needs to be a new attitude, basically new rounds of negotiations could make a difference. Former members of these armed structures in Colombia have basically also explained that in these rounds of dialogue, there needs to be concessions and there need to be small wins. So we think that last year showed us that Colombia's efforts at environmental peace building failed due to the absence of the state in the areas which are the most important environmental assets. Nevertheless, there's a new opportunity this year to retake dialogues with these non-state armed groups and demand that they keep deforestation in check, decrease the number as a sort of requirement to advance in talks, and that the state even could think of making investments in social infrastructure in territories under armed group control, which would please the communities that belong to their social basis. Because in the end, it's all about making compromises. So this is something that has been on the radar of us last year and will continue to be this and probably in 2026 as well.
Thank you very much, Ram. I mean, the through line, as Jojo said, citing Erika's work, the kind of governance questions, right? And really that presence or absence thereof of the state and these other non-state actors of particularly your focus and coming to this as a criminologist, I think is so productive and such a neglected frame in the kind of long arc of environment security, climate security, that this just hasn't been a set of really powerful actors that have been a focus of attention. And I think your explanation of the complexities and over a relatively very short amount of time, right? Just the last few years, the kind of real big changes that can come with, on the one hand, really promising environmental priority and environmental peace building as a priority of the new government. At the same time, the complexity of the responses and the players challenge some of our traditional frameworks for how to analyze this and who's at the table. So incredibly, incredibly valuable. Erika, can we turn to you and pose that same question in terms of key environmental peace building developments in the areas that you focus and some of the work that you've been doing in this space?
Sure. First of all, I want to thank everyone for showing up today. It is so wonderful to see so many people on the screen, even if it's mostly your names. But hopefully at some point people will turn on their cameras so we can greet everyone properly. Thank you, Marissa, for waving, Miguel. And I also want to note, this recording will be online afterwards, and we have a platform where we share all this information from the community, from the Environmental Peacebuilding Organization. And it is the Environmental Peacebuilding Knowledge Platform, which is at environmentalpeacebuilding.org. It is currently undergoing a revamp, which is fantastic. So I really encourage you to look at the website, especially if you want, look at the gender, natural resources, climate, and peace page, because that one really showcases the work that is ongoing to make the platform more accessible, more clear for our members and others who are interested in the field of environmental peace building. And I also just, hope people will chime in too in the chat with issues that you would like for us to talk about, because you're only getting a snapshot of the three of us and Geoff, and we don't cover all the issues that our members in the association work on. And so I just want to note that right away. This is a snapshot of the breadth of issues. And when we talk about environmental peace building, we talk about the entire conflict cycle. And so just to acknowledge, it's not just the role that natural resources plays in building peace, but also the role of natural resources in leading to conflict, but also what happens to the environment and natural resources during war, and the role of different actors, from women to children to different, combatants. So just understanding there is a breadth of topics that are likely not being covered in our comments, and just with the few areas that I work on, I'm just also going to give a snapshot to do this rather briefly, but I'll start with, because Geoff says I work on water and energy, and those are topics that I've worked on for a very long time. And starting in Central Asia, I worked on the basin for a very long time, looking at the role of international actors in building international agreements to prevent the outbreak of conflict after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And I will note, that's a case where it ebbs and flows in the news. Sometimes you hear there's some simmering conflicts. We need to, or international actors, US government, Europeans are interested again in engaging in Central Asia. And then it's quiet and everybody presumes the RLC is fine. Over the last year, there's been more attention being paid again to Central Asia and water there. And that is largely because of developments in Afghanistan. And I think sometimes we forget that even if we have an international water basin or a treaty that, in a basin, sometimes different riparians are left out of those agreements. And that was the case in Central Asia. The current agreements are between the 5 Central Asian states, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, and Afghanistan is also a riparian and has been left out. And in in recent years, over the last year in particular, Afghanistan has been building a canal, the Kosh Tepe Canal in northern Afghanistan, that will withdraw water from the Amu Darya, which is one of the main rivers that feeds into the Aral Sea. And for those of you who have paid attention to Central Asia, the Aral Sea, since the mid-20th century, has largely desiccated. It is completely dried up because the Central Asian states withdrew water for cotton cultivation. The Amu Darya is still, and the Sir Darya are the two main rivers. And Afghanistan also needs water, especially in the north, for its population there. It needs it, essentially to rejuvenate the agricultural sector. And it is going ahead, the Taliban is basically self-funding this canal in northern Afghanistan that will then have implications for Central Asia and water management and for potential water conflicts. And so this is an area, that people have been starting to look at, but again, it's very hard to do field work on the ground. And so that's one area that I would flag that, often when we study water and international water agreements, we presume sometimes that they are static, and often they can be disrupted either through new riparians trying, tapping the water for their own domestic uses or because of climate change. And that's one that also, climate change will affect the flow of the rivers themselves because these are glacier-fed rivers. So there's two variables that will essentially impact how water is managed in Central Asia. So that's water. Energy, I think this is I think there's a confluence of where we are today talking about critical minerals, Latin America, in this sense of the extractives, which have really defined a lot of the conflicts when it comes to energy resources and in Latin America. But also we are increasingly mining for critical minerals, and we're mining for the green transition. And Jojo talked a lot about this. Bram touched upon this. And this notion, this tension between this global green transition and mining for critical minerals, I think is something that we need to pay more attention to, especially from what's happening in the communities that reside near the mining sites. So, in South America, we're talking about the Lithium Triangle. I've spent time working in Bolivia, in the Salar de Uyuni. And even though Bolivia is the one country that hasn't been exporting to the same extent that Chile and Argentina have, there is the beginning of conflicts emerging between the local communities and the government, but also potentially with the companies that are going to come in and mine. And here, I think, we have lots of lessons that we can turn to from the environmental peace building community already. Lots of our members have worked on the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative. We can see whether those types of governance mechanisms are applicable to critical minerals, whether we need to be thinking about alternatives. Also, we have a lot of our members who work on environmental defenders and land defenders. And, many communities where critical minerals reside, you see the emergence of activists who are trying to protect their communities, trying to protect the water that may be used for the mining, but also is used for drinking water or agriculture. We're seeing a different array of companies that are mining for critical minerals from the traditional extractive sector. These are different companies from oil and gas and also from gold. So it's a whole new set of companies that may not adhere to or abide by the conventional governance mechanisms that have emerged to protect the environment or to mandate social safeguards. So these are issues that I think need to be looked at increasingly. We see in South America the emergence of, mechanisms such as public consultations, prior consultations. Um, we also see in other places this notion of impact and benefit agreements with local communities that sort of bypass the state. But we really need to understand who the companies are and also protections for environmental defenders, because this is, I think, in many ways it's a new landscape, especially when you have companies that haven't had to adhere to the same governance mechanisms as some of the other multinational corporations. So I'll stop there. Maybe I could talk about, yeah.
Yeah, no, that's terrific, Erika. And I think your comments make me think that on the one hand, that we have some really valuable early experience or earlier experience that that would be useful to bring into what has, at least for me in this space, had a very heavy recent focus on climate change and security, climate change, and the imperatives in addressing those challenges. And I think sometimes that leads us to not pay as much attention as we might productively pay attention to some of those early 1990s where, fair enough, climate change wasn't given much priority and should have been given more, but the natural resource management governance issues that you and Bram are really highlighting, and certainly, the mining and JoJo's work, those lessons that we learned from those periods, and whether, the transparency initiatives, Kimberley process, these kinds of the early water, the kind of switch from this deterministic narrative around water is going to cause conflict to really understanding that, particularly at the country to country level, that there's a whole lot of cooperation if you work at it, that there's a lot that we can learn and not be exclusively focused on climate, particularly if we understand that more broadly. And at the same time, as I mentioned after Bram's intervention and your focus on environmental defenders, those early years also missed some really important stuff and have completely neglected that more individualized, local, often unreported, unseen violence that what Bram is studying in the Andean region, but of course goes on all over the world. And that's an area where the environmental peace building and the broader environment security, climate security community, at least on the research side, has really missed the boat. And so that wider frame and more inclusive notion, as you emphasized, Erika, that we want to have with the association, that those issues are critically important, historically neglected in our studying and responding to it, and ties very directly to some of these dynamics that Bram is laying out, for example, and I'm sure all of you would have additional examples of. So thank you for those kind of through lines, and I'll urge you to all three of you to feel free to respond to each other's, because of course there's some really interesting connections. So Jojo, if we can come back to you with a second question, are there key environmental peace building related events, contexts, flashpoints, or opportunities, right, that you'll be following, kind of looking forward, right? So we spent a first round looking back, but what are you looking at going forward in these future months, future years?
Great. Yes. I mean, I'll start with yesterday's inaugural speech, I guess, because I think President Trump will reframe everything that we tried to do in the past several years in terms of notions of cooperation around climate governance, the idea of building alliances in promoting global decarbonization. So I think we need to pay attention what the executive orders might mean. But so I know, and I don't work in American politics at all, but I look at this as sort of a domestic political situation that has global ramifications, because what the US will do will significantly impact markets. It will create opportunities and constraints for developing countries, for mining countries. It will certainly create a reaction to China. And we do a lot of work in China on rare earths industry, you know, the permanent magnet sector, the EV car. So it'll be a big, I think it's a big task, and it's a big task for everyone to sort of tease out what are the continuities and what are the changes. I think it's also really important to remember that if we now look back at what happened under the Biden administration, and we can talk about it in the past, is that there are more continuities in terms of some of the strategic competition policies of Biden with the first Trump administration. And actually, that has shaped the response of China in the past 5-6 years. So I think drawing out the lessons in terms of the position, the motivations, but also how the US strategy on climate, on energy, how that melds into traditional areas such as manufacturing, you know, the high-tech industry, figuring out what the new administration is planning to do is the task ahead. Are we looking in a situation where we probably need to really accept that we will have two supply chains where China and US will be leading very, very different industries, pushing for different energy transition pathway strategies? Or are we going to have a situation in which there will still be some moments and spaces and conjunctural moments, I would say, in which there may be potential for cooperation between China and the US. And as you know, I sit in Europe, where they have always been kind of watching what's happening in the US, but also needing to respond to China. From where I sit, from where I am, we're very much, of course, interested what the policy would be for countries that are interested to build cooperation with the United States, whether it's on securing access to critical minerals, whether it's on energy transition, but also domestic political choices. You know, he seems to be not a fan of EV cars, which is a surprise to me because Elon Musk has been very active in his, you know, in his campaign. But so to me, that's an interesting, from an environmental politics point of view, it's a really interesting dynamic. How does the policy that he will put forward affect the EV car industry, which, by the way, is already lagging behind BYD? So it's an interesting dynamic that will have consequences, because if the US will decide to switch back to, you know, a more traditional, conventional automotive industry, what does that mean then to the climate targets? What does it mean to have Trump withdrawing from the Paris Accord? Does it mean that the US will set its own, you know, target at its own pace? Will it ignore what has been done in the past and will take a different pathway? So I think this is going to be very important for other countries. So it's not just studying the US and what's happening there on its own, but understanding the broader implications for other countries, for the communities, for the mining, you know, regions where these extractive industries are taking place. So because also we should not be talking about this as if it's going to happen in the future. It is happening now, as Erika has pointed out. The second point, I think, that's really important, and which brings in some of the arguments already put forward by Erika and Carl, is I do think there is going to be a pushback from communities, particularly in places where the mining has not had political legitimacy as a development strategy. I think we often, the main problem I have generally with people who's, you know, if you look at mining, people assume that it has no political legitimacy, which isn't true. That's why you have Peru, that's why you have Chile, Indonesia, Brazil. They have vibrant, productive, competitive mining industry. They have strong regulatory frameworks. They're pushing for mining. But there are, of course, places like Serbia where there has been a lot of friction between the EU, China, Rio Tinto, and the government. And those are the flashpoints, I think, of conflict, where we will see how the global decarbonization agenda is creating more conflict rather than trying to resolve, and rather than pushing for a collective action strategy in terms of solving or promoting global decarbonization strategies. So it's really important to have a much more nuanced approach to understand why in some cases, for example, free, prior, and informed consent works. and in other cases it doesn't work. We have done some research. My work, my last book is about state enterprises in the oil and gas and the mining industry. These state companies in developing countries will stay. In some cases, they're being recreated. In other cases, you're actually making new state companies, because there's now also a drive for industrial policy. There's a drive for strategic competition. So there's more state in the economy, in the environment, and we need to have a better understanding. What does this mean? Does it mean that state companies are better in terms of following environmental standards? Or does it mean that they could just greenwash because they're part of the government strategy? So I think these are very important questions, because we would end up having to figure out, we would have to accept that the nature of our energy transition is going to be very fragmented. It's very much conflict driven. And I think looking for spaces of cooperation is going to be much harder from this point onwards. I'll stop there.
No, that's terrific, Jojo. I appreciate it. As you rightly point out, we've got certainly in this last week, a big potential change in trajectories and certainly governance structures and approaches from key players. And that absolutely is going to have ripple effects in ways that are, one can anticipate they're going to happen, a little harder to anticipate exactly what's going to happen. So I appreciate you bringing that down into this kind of specific area and helping us orient our kind of ongoing investigations of how that plays out. Bram, can we turn to you too? You've talked about how critical 2024 was with big changes, and looking forward. And I think somewhere in there too, tell us a little bit more about Amazon Underworld, this new project, and how that factors into kind of how we can take advantage of the work you're doing and learn from it.
Thank you, Geoff, and thank you for mentioning our project. So at the moment, we're starting an endeavor which consists of cross-border investigative journalism in the Amazon, where we work with 6 media outlets in the 6 largest Amazon countries. We want to better understand organized crime, their impacts, and come up with policy responses as well. So what we do is we quantify and map illicit economies through remote sensing. We're building databases with machine learning and AI as well. But we also travel to the Amazon to tell the human stories behind the maps and the data. We interact with a wide variety of sources. On the one hand, of course, environmental experts, academics, law enforcement, indigenous community leaders, but we also speak to the gold miners, the drug traffickers, the gang members, and the members of non-state armed groups, because oftentimes they are people who are born and bred in the Amazon, and they have very valid reasons why they participate in crime. And if we don't understand them, we can't come up with tangible policy recommendations. So what we do is we conduct research, write journalistic content, but also repackage into policy papers and then articulate with the governments of Amazon countries, UN agencies, and foreign donors from mainly EU countries and the Americans, well, up to now. When we travel to the Amazon, we always find some sort of governance, but mostly this is governance of the criminal kind. We need to ask the criminals to our permission to travel to the regions we want to work in for research. This makes us understand that when we ask ourselves the question, when does crime prevail in the Amazon? It is right now, because it's them governing large swathes of rainforest. We started to map the presence of criminal organizations and non-state armed groups in Amazon municipalities and found them in 70% and in 100% of Amazon municipalities that share a borderline. We also know that organized crime prevails when their budgets outsize state budgets to counter them. In Brazil, for example, there's one municipality bordering Colombia called Japura, which is infested with illegal mining barges, which are these metallic beasts on rivers scooping up sediments, processing them with mercury on the boats itself to extract fine concentrations of gold. In just the municipality of Japura, gold generates more illicit revenues than the national state budget of Brazil's environmental police. which means that they're fighting a losing fight when organized crime can buy a vault judges, buy chiefs of police, colonels in the army, because oftentimes the miners know when sporadic crackdowns will take place. Organized crime is always cross-border because there is a transfer of money, goods, environmental harms. And we know that organized crime is very good at this, what we call criminal diplomacy. When we see Brazilian crime syndicates from as far as Rio de Janeiro and Sao Paulo rock up to the Amazon because they come for the drug trafficking, but they stay for the gold. And they make supply chain alliances with Colombian rural guerrilla organizations. We know that if we want to fight organized crime, states also need to learn from the criminals how to collaborate across borders. Therefore, we think 2025 is a crucial year. We had a COP16 on biodiversity in Colombia last year, which is an Amazon country, but a COP30 on climate will be held within the Amazon region in Belém do Pará in Brazil later this year. So we know that between those two COPs, all eyes are focused on the Amazon, and there needs to be a new impulse for cross-border collaboration to rethink a security strategy for the Amazon, not based on militaristic approaches, but based on what security means for the ecosystem and Amazon communities who are most apt, most able to protect the rainforest. And we think that there are many valuable lessons to be learned from Colombia and its attempts and failures to broker environmental peace, because Colombian conflict dynamics and Colombia's non-state armed groups cross the borders to Peru, Ecuador, widely into Venezuela. And it's very important to also acknowledge that there is a new momentum in what is called the Amazon Cooperation Treaty Organization, which is basically a multilateral group for all Amazon nations, which has a new Secretary General, Martin von Hildebrand, and we hope to engage with him as well to put the country governments together and rethink security from a different perspective than what has been done before. And for that, this year will be crucial.
I really appreciate you bookending the biodiversity negotiations and the upcoming climate ones to be hosted in Brazil. And it's one that I think it would be good for us all to reflect on how we are or aren't connecting this kind of very nuanced on the ground understanding of talking to all the stakeholders that Bram has just talked about in this context, and how much or how little of the peace and conflict dimensions are explicitly part of those negotiations at that kind of country to country level, right? And so one might suspect that, as Bram suggested, the governments would have something to learn about cross-border cooperation and collaboration in this space from the criminal networks that are able to do it, and finding ways to get that in. Erika, can we turn to you two in terms of where you're going to be looking? I noted one of the, Mara had a question for you in particular, where some other water conflict and hopefully peace building hotspots to look at going forward.
Yeah, thank you again. And I'm going to continue to do some plugs for association things along the way, but just also, these are all topics that we hope, all of you will send articles to the journal, Environment and Security. And just to note that it is a journal for both research articles, but also practitioner insights. And sometimes we do interviews with leading practitioners or scholars. And so please look at the journal website, because we would love to receive articles on all of these topics. And it is interdisciplinary, so all disciplines. So going forward, I'm going to sort of shift gears a little bit, maybe answer Mara's question. And also I saw Alex put in something about Ukraine. And, I think 2025 is going to be a really important year for those of us who really look at the environmental impacts of war, without a doubt. And you can look at it from multiple perspectives, and I hope Carl will jump in too in this area, and maybe Mara and others, because there's been lots of developments in the international law community. The International Law Commission has really been working to advance legal principles to better protect the environment during armed conflict. And so, that is one area where I think we will continue to see clear, more advancements. We have members of our community who work on, quantifying, tracking the environmental impacts of war in Ukraine, in Gaza, in Syria, Lebanon, and elsewhere, and really looking at the environmental harm that comes from the destruction of power plants, refineries, threats to biodiversity that was mentioned in the Black Sea, to wetlands. Ukraine has really shown us the dangers of when nuclear power plants are shelled, and threats to the people who need to maintain nuclear safety of the power plants. And so I think this is an area where we're going to see a lot more attention, a lot more work in 2025. It's not clear, the extent to whether, conflicts will or wars will come to an end, but we really need to be focusing on these environmental impacts, largely because of the implications for human well-being, human security. And I think that's one of the things as a community we do is we really also don't just think about national security, but we really think about human security and the linkages between the environment, human rights, and human security. This is where water really matters because I think a need to focus our attention on ensuring access to clean water will become increasingly important. And this is part of the rebuilding process. Jojo mentioned changes that are coming in 2025. The United States has pulled out of the Paris Agreement, but we've also pulled out of, are suggesting that we're pulling out of the World Health Organization, which will have tremendous implications for preventing the spread of potential deadly diseases. And this is an area where water is very much linked to human health. We see outbreaks of, polio in different conflict-affected regions. We see cholera outbreaks, for example, in Yemen. And so we can't pull away from addressing those issues. And this is, I think, again, where the association is so important, because we are an association of academics, practitioners, activists, people who work in many of these international organizations on the, who are doing like the post-conflict assessments, the environmental assessments that then provide the foundation for rebuilding, and also thinking about, looking at, in some ways, the implications for climate change, because war also is one of the largest emitters of, greenhouse gases and carbon emissions. And so, just trying to have a very integrative approach as we continue to focus on many of these ongoing conflicts and the water implications. And I think, just honing in on this notion of ensuring access to basic services is foundational for understanding the role that the environmental peacebuilding community plays in, the humanitarian sector and reconstruction rebuilding. So I will stop there.
No, thank you, Erika. And in some ways, some of your points may get at my kind of final question for the three of you, but I'm also cognizant that we have a lot of great people on here and want to make sure we have time for Q&A. So maybe a final lightning round among the three of you, which gives you a chance to maybe identify a couple either topics or places or that you'd like to see somebody do the work. It's not kind of in your space, but the wish list. I also like to think of this as serving our graduate student members who are looking for that thesis topic that you see as particularly promising because it's an important topic, but also one that's been understudied. And so maybe just we can do that quickly. And those of you who have questions, get them ready or drop them in the chat, and we can get to a Q&A. But Jojo, what's kind of on your watch list, wish list, suggestions for work that you'd like to see done, even if it's not you doing it?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'll start with we should stop obsessing about lithium, cobalt, and nickel and rare earths because like I think like that should, you know, there's important work that's being done there, but we have so many other commodities and minerals and supply chains that are very important that would involve also other countries where you could do field work. So I think that's really important to kind of branch out beyond the EV car industry as the energy transition pathway. So I think that's the first, like just looking into the supply chain, there's almost like a concentration of work in specific commodities, which is not really, I mean, it's great, but it doesn't help us sort of get the bigger picture of how complicated the supply chains and the energy transition is. So that's first. The second is, I mean, I've been saying the energy transition will be very different for different regions, but for specific countries as well. And I just think like that needs to be recognized when we do the work in terms of figuring out, you know, energy transition strategies of countries. And again, one thing that we always point out, I've been doing a lot of work on Brazil for several years. Brazil has had renewable energy since the 1970s and 1980s, but no one's looking at Brazil as an example of how you actually curb high dependence on oil and gas and coal. So I think it's it's really important to look at countries outside of our comfort zone, meaning the EU and North America. Look at countries, look at good governance practices that we can find in other places. And they're not as difficult as one would think. I just think like we just need to have an open mind that there could be learnings from other countries, you know. And then the extreme opposite of that is the choice of some research because it's so difficult to do, like Congo. I've been asked multiple times why I'm not studying cobalt in Congo. So my answer is I cannot do that because I have no experience doing field work in conflict zones. So I also think like how we figure out research and methodological designs, I think we should look more broadly in terms of what we can do. There's a lot of research out there on that. And just on a final point, I've been really interested around the question of and the Wilson Center has been really good in forcing me to think about this, the idea of scales of governance and scales of cooperation. Because so in my case, I do a lot of work at national and subnational level, and now increasingly I've started to pay attention at the international. I mean, I've been very lucky in the sense that I have a grant that allows me to do this cross-cutting work. But I think that for PhD level or you know, like small scale kind of work, we could have strategic projects where you could think about the connections between the different scales of governance. Because actually, in terms of lessons from the mining industry, in terms of lessons on decarbonization, there's a lot of material already that we have produced in the past 20 years. We have to systematize that. But I also think that what we need to do is to learn the connections between them. There are fundamental trade-offs that have to be made when you push an energy transition strategy based on electric vehicle cars versus a wind power. There are trade-offs when you're a mining country or an oil exporting country and your revenues are entirely dependent on the extraction of these minerals. So the question there would be, what are the right governance structures? What are the regulations that need to be in place so that we can moderate the impacts, the inevitable social, health, and environmental impacts of mining operations? And then, of course, I think the idea that I mean, I think it's becoming very pessimistic now thinking about international cooperation. But I do think it's important to remember that countries and transnational actors are interested in building spaces in areas of cooperation. And I just think like we need to keep that work because that's what's going to open scientific cooperation. That's what's going to open work between developing countries and, you know, European and American universities. So it's, I think, these sort of different areas.
Yeah,
Thanks.
no, that's very helpful, Jojo. That's a rich intervention with lots of ways to pursue. Bram, as somebody who has worked a lot in conflict zones, it's great kind of complementary opportunity to, what's on your wish list?
Well, what I would like to see more is action-based research when it comes to resolving these governance gaps in these critical ecosystems that we all would like to see protected. Of course, looking at the map of the Amazon is just an enormous green spot on Google Maps, scrolling, zoom out, and it's it's kind of evident why the states are not present everywhere. It's just too big to control. And to be very frank, I also don't think that more state presence would necessarily be good news, especially when it comes to more military interventions. We know this goes hand in hand with more human rights violations. Investments in infrastructure carve open the rainforest for all sorts of unwanted people who do harm to the Amazon rainforest. But we do see that communities who are provenly in the best position to protect the rainforest need to be empowered in their efforts. Of course, it makes sense to delimit more collective lands for ethnic groups like indigenous groups, Afro-descendants, even peasant populations who should be incentivized to look for ways to harmoniously live together with the rainforest. But oftentimes we see these groups are criminalized because they have some environmental footprint, which of course they will have because they've been living there for ages. We do think that organized crime poses an existential threat to many of these Amazon communities because they either absorb them in their activities or they exterminate them, which we see in cases of some of the indigenous groups in voluntary isolation. What I would like to see more research focused on is on how international stakeholders can help local groups better monitor and protect their lands, which can be with technological tools such as GPS, drones. But then also we recognize that in some areas already under criminal control, I would not recommend an indigenous leader to fly a drone because he or she will be killed the next day, or sometimes even calling the police will get an indigenous leader killed the next day due to the factor of corruption. So I think it's very important to study the opportunities for the empowerment of local protective measures by Amazon communities and how maybe new technologies can aid them in the efforts to detect violent and harmful invaders in their territory, let's say gold prospectors, but also need to think about the follow-up. Can we trust on the state to intervene? Because we cannot expect unarmed civilians to confront weaponized gold miners. So there needs to be a sort of external party to respond and rid violent invaders. But we need to study better how grassroots activism and community solutions can be part of the solution, but need to be backed up by technology and response by tertiary parties.
Really interesting comment about the role of technology in this kind of multi-level governance and response. That really, yeah, make me think. Again, you're bringing things together, Brown, that we haven't done enough of. So really appreciate that. Erika, final wish list for you, and then we've got some questions in the chat, and we can open it up.
Sure. So I'll keep it very brief and put on my academic hat. You know, what I think would be great if there are PhD students or researchers who are looking for projects is helping to build the evidence base for environmental peace building. So really digging into various projects, trying to do comparative analysis, maybe even building large, you know, data sets, but really trying to demonstrate when environmental peace building programs work and when they don't work, and understanding the mechanisms that allow what we call environmental peace building to actually have impact. And so anyone who can help us build that evidence base and also generate lessons learned from what didn't work and what needs to be done differently, I think is really important for the community and for expanding the knowledge platform. And the other area tied to that, which I think builds on Graham's point, is a lot of the work that many of us do is in partnership with community activists, environmental defenders, land defenders, and we need to think about the methods that we use and also the the ethics behind those methods to ensure that we are not causing harm. And I think that's something that most of us are very attentive to, but I think being very explicit as we do research about our methodology is also really important, especially when we are partnering with community members. So I will stop there.
No, thank you, Erika. That's terrific. Well, now we do have an opportunity for questions. If folks would like to ask them, come on camera and ask them. Go ahead and use the raise hand function, and we'll try to do that. And then I'd also urge our panelists to check out the chat because there are a couple of questions. Jojo in particular, a couple that get at they're interested in learning more about these good governance practices in the field of mining, and are there examples where relations weren't good between mining and communities and turned around, and what were some of the examples of those methods? But we can jump straight to putting Joe onto those questions, or again, folks should feel free to again drop it in the chat or raise your hand and join the conversation. And we'll try to be on gallery view so we can actually see folks. Well, while folks are thinking, Jojo, why don't you, if you would, take those two questions that, let me see, Shweta and Alea posed about some examples.
Practices, yes. I mean, I think there's a really broad, there's a huge literature around environmental governance, but also I think the institutional aspect of governance, and then of course the question around rights and inclusion. I've done a lot of work on FPIC, free priority informed consultation. Back then we still call it consent. So there have been instances where FPIC has actually worked in the case of Philippines, for example. There's a lot of study in Latin America looking at local level dynamics, mostly focusing on why in some communities FPIC has been effective in promoting specific community interests versus others. And then of course the sort of the dark side of PIC and political legitimization, etc. So I would say there are those literature that we already have established. We're doing some work with Erika and with looking at some of these lessons from the mining industry applicable to critical raw materials, or do we need a new set of initiatives to kind of figure out critical raw materials, which is much more securitized, more weaponized, more within the purview of the state. So I think that's also one of the big differences with critical raw materials, is that it kind of sits in very quickly to geopolitics conversation. So does it mean that stuff we know about mining doesn't apply to it anymore? So I think there's that conversation that we need to have. But certainly FPIC Transparency Initiative, I think there's a really interesting set of work in looking in Southeast Asia. So in many mining places like Latin America and Africa, there's sort of an extractive imperative, right? Like that these are primary raw material producing countries, and therefore that's the way to insert themselves in the supply chain. There's an interesting dynamic happening in Southeast Asia in which they have a lot of minerals, but because there's some level of manufacturing capacity that has been developed in the past 2-3 decades, there's now a decline in mining investment in the region. And now because we have a whole critical raw materials and for critical raw competition between different types of FDIs. I think like one interesting thing to look at mining is sort of how it fits in the broader political economy structures in specific regions, in specific countries. Because then I think the dynamics of the legitimacy of the country comes in, the argument around the developmental imperative on mining. We can then start looking at that in a much why is not in others. I think at the last, what I always wanted, what I always say, because mining is an extremely topic. I always say that we have to look at mining from the point of view of trade-offs, because I think it's also disingenuous, especially in Europe. I always hear this argument about, oh, we should have responsible mining, should try to get in a situation in which mining would be cost-free in the sense that it would do no harm. I think part of a realistic conversation has to be there is harm in mining because you're changing the land. There are trade-offs in mining. So I think that the question is what kind of governance standards can we put there such that we are able to say that the costs that we're paying is worthwhile, and therefore we're going to proceed. And that whole swathe of knowledge that we have around civil society participation, transparency initiative, that all kick in, and that makes more conversation where they're accepting that there are costs, but then we are aware that we're making those costs and whether we want to make those trade-offs as well.
Terrific. Thank you very much, Jojo. And I urge you, since folks have expressed interest, in fact, all of you, drop some links into the chat so people can follow up with your projects and dig into some of these examples. Can I ask Carl Brook to come on and ask a question, in part because I know he has one, but also to give an opportunity to recognize him as our kind of fearless leader in setting up this association and running this association as president, is continuing to play a prominent role as executive director and kind of prime driver and making that journal happen after I can attest literally years of working to make it happen. And so, Carl, could we ask you, as somebody who is quite experienced in this space, to pose a question?
Thank you, Geoff, for your kind words. I'm very touched. I'm curious, this may be more for people in the US, but I think it applies to people in many places. Even as environmental peace building has gained strength and awareness and it's more and more mainstreamed, you see jobs and publications focusing on environmental peace building. These are very scary times. There is a decrease in multilateralism in many ways. There's a rise in nationalism. After years of decreases in conflicts, there's an increase in conflicts. And I'm wondering if you have any advice for people on how to keep your optimism, how to keep moving forward. How do you kind of maintain your energy in these times? And I'm not just talking about, in the US, but, this is, in Ukraine. Ukraine has, been under tremendous threat for years now. How do you not get ground down by what happens?
All right. Who would like to field that one? It's certainly challenging, but essential to have strategies to do that. Anyone want to take that on? You guys
I mean,
are tackling
I'll
big challenges.
start just because someone's got to start.
Yeah, right.
But I would love for others who are on the screen to jump in because, moments of optimism are rare. And I think many of us stay in this field because we have to maintain some optimism. And I think that often comes from working in the field. I know Marissa spends a lot of time in the field, so I'm going to maybe ask you to jump in a second. And I think it is finding partners to work with maintains that level of optimism. And, in the university, I spend a lot of time working with NGOs who are working in the humanitarian sector and bringing students into projects with them as a way to ensure that there is a human component to the work that we are teaching on environment, conflict, and peace building. And, I think that is what is so important, is not to lose sight of why we're doing this work. It is not many of us are scholars, but it is not an academic field of study. It is because we truly engage with our colleagues, both, who are across the academy, but also working in international organizations, as Kelly said, working in the humanitarian sector. So, working with colleagues who are working on, migration and refugee policy. And I think that's, what continues to motivate and drive at least me and maybe others. And I would love for Marissa to say a few words, because I know you spend a tremendous amount of time in the field.
Okay. I'm actually not sure that I am the best person to answer that question, because I don't really have a strategy. I know that some colleagues have described me as disgustingly cheerful. I'm not sure that I like that denomination. So in part, it may be my personality, I don't know. But it's what I chose to do. I mean, my background, my academic training is in applied environmental anthropology with a focus on the applied study of crisis. So from the beginning, my entire work has focused on crisis situations. And I think that what keeps me motivated is the why that you also alluded to, Erika, is the conviction that the work I do, the work we do, matters, and that we are making a contribution to a better understanding of the conditions on the ground, and that understanding has the proven potential to make a positive difference on the lives of the people we're working with. And these days we're talking about co-generating knowledge in a way that is more inclusive. And in spite of all the setbacks, we have to keep going, because what is the alternative? And I think that those of us who are privileged enough to have the training, to have the networks, to have the passion to be working in this field, is almost like a moral imperative to put these, traits to good use, because we are making a difference. And I think that's valued, and that's what keeps me going. So no, I don't feel that the work that I do working in conflict, disaster, all of the above affected countries gets me down. I find it motivating, more of, the more reason to keep on working. So I, for one, am looking forward to continue working in this field. Is what I chose to do, and I think is one of the best decisions I've ever made. So thank you for being my colleagues in this field.
Thank you very much, Marissa. I think that kind of commitment is one that is shared by many in the association, and definitely is critical driver. I also think just certainly a strategy that in environmental leadership classes we discuss a lot, which is understanding the larger context and then finding the bite-sized pieces to make a difference in kind of immediate context by geography, by issue area, by team and partners. And so not unrealistically expecting oneself to solve the entire problems, but to find a piece. And I think that's been part of, in some ways, the kind of connected to the methodological approach in many environmental peace building, which is start building the trust over time with the partnerships and collaborations. And sometimes that's with folks who are already friends and collaborators. And sometimes that's the kind of conversations that Bram is talking about having with all the players, and for playing all the different roles. I wanted to pick up on a couple things in the chat. Toy Ho asked about some other areas where environmental peace building and some of these conflict challenges play out. Biofuels, for example, and kind of water and dam space. Maybe Erika, Carl, from the perspective of the association, I know we have folks working in that. So maybe a word about the affinity groups and how folks have the opportunity to drill down by sector and geography through those means where we can have these kind of conversations on topics we've talked about today, but also a lot of the important ones that we haven't.
Erika, do you want to take the lead and I'll post the link to the interest groups?
Sure, sure. So again, what makes the association so robust is that the ability for members to partake in areas that interest them. And so we've responded through the creation of these interest groups, some of which, were that came about, because we thought, there should be one on gender or one on water, disasters. But they also have a regional component. So there's one on Africa, and there are ways for members to meet in a smaller community and to plan events. And often the interest groups, and you can, good, Carl put the list in there because the list keeps growing. And we also, there's a law one, monitoring and evaluation, forests, one for young professionals, which I think is really important if you're just starting out in your career. But it's a way, if you see an issue that you can't identify with one of these interest groups, we ask you to pitch a new interest group to us. But often members of the interest group will, I'm going to do this very briefly, will organize online events. They could organize something in person at a side event. Or as we ramp up to our next conference, we just had one in 2024 in Leiden. Our next conference will be in Ottawa in 2026. You will see a number of events leading up to the conference in 2026, often organized by the interest groups. So I would encourage you all to look at the interest groups and reach out to the interest group leads.
Yeah.
Carl, is there anything else?
I just want to note that there's some in addition to kind of the networking and the sharing of information, there are, and learning, there are some strategic opportunities that the interest groups pursue. And I mentioned this in the context of the law interest group, which is supporting the UN Special Rapporteur on Toxics and Human Rights, which he is developing a report on toxics and military activities, both during conflict and in the preparation for conflict. So we're helping him to kind of crowdsource examples and things that he could highlight in his report. And we did this also for the International Law Commission in the development of the international principles on protection of the environment in relation to armed conflict. So there's some of it's more learning and some of it is very much applied in helping to kind of set things up or help people think through the problems that they're experiencing in their day-to-day work.
Terrific. Thank you both for that. I see somewhat amazingly, we've come to the end of our time. This has been a super rich conversation. Jojo, Brem, and Erika, Carl, thank you so much for sharing the work that you're doing. It really, I think, illustrates the diversity and richness of the topic area, the different ways that we can build on previous work, but also really show that with the examples that we've heard today, that there's lots of space for work that in filling some gaps in neglected areas that are critically important, and that we have whether it's these kind of different governance dimensions, whether it's a set of actors that we've historically neglected in the analysis, that it's hard work to do. Yet we have a committed group literally all over the world tackling it. And so it's terrific to have this association after many years of not having critical mass and a place to come together, that we have that. And thank you, Erika. Thank you, Carl, for making that possible. So thanks to our speakers. Look forward to next year's and the many sessions that we'll have before then to tackle what are inevitably really challenging but super important challenges in the environmental peace building space. So thank you very much on behalf of the association. Thanks especially to our speakers today.
Thanks, Geoff.